episode 84, Miracles. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, we welcome returning guest Brian Blais to talk about miracles. Andrew gives an update on the failed prayer to heal his eyesight, and towards the end of the show, we have a special appearance by David from Skeptics and Seekers. We cover quite a few miracle-related topics in this show, so it's worth looking at the links in the show notes. There are about 17 of them. For further discussion regarding the shoe on the roof NDE story that we raise and Gary Habermas likes to promote, see the Digital Gnosis YouTube video in link 1. It's a very long video and they talk about a lot of cases, including the shoe one. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. Regular host Matthew at the helm here, and this time for the second time in a row, I have Andrew. How did we manage that, Andrew? It's amazing.
It's practically a miracle.
It is absolutely a miracle. And by sheer coincidence, we also have a world-renowned expert on miracles, returning guest, Brian Blais. How are you, Brian? Wonderful to have you back on.
No, thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure. Now, I feel that I'm in a bit of a quandary at the moment because I have been very critical of the whole concept of miracles. But today of all days, today, the day that we scheduled in advance without knowing the future that we were going to be recording this, a miracle has happened. Boris Johnson has resigned as Prime Minister of this glorious land. Of course, he's trashed it. He's stomped over all the glorious flower beds and done other unspeakable ills to it. But the monster has resigned. Praise be, it is a miracle. And for you guys who might not know what happens now, a fair little land, and so you want a little bit of context to put this on because this will go out in a few weeks' time. It is also the day after those wicked satanic stones in Georgia were also bombed. So that's for my American friends, so you can put that in your calendars and when we are recording this. So from that bombshell, what do we feel about miracles?
Why does it take God so long to do any good?
Oh, what are you talking about?
Sorry.
Boris Johnson or the satanic stones in Georgia?
Well, okay, let's start with Boris. Let's just pretend that there's a God, and let's not call this a miracle. Let's say that this is divine providence, which seems to be sort of a step down from miracles. If there's a God that has an overarching plan, and somehow in the background, he's pulling the levers of the universe for a divine plan. It certainly seems that on the occasions when a Christian will say, well, God is at work. It doesn't seem to be some miracle claim like God regrew a limb. It's just some overarching plan. What I want to hear them say, what I think they should say is, well, finally, God took an interest and did something about it. I really do want to know, if you think there's a God performing some act of intervention, whether you call it miraculous or not, it seems to take him a long time to turn his head and care.
Yes.
Why does it take so long?
Absolutely. And sticking with the Boris Johnson theme, and I apologise, listeners, if you didn't already have a hint of where my politics are. Well, this is the unadulterated, this is the child unfriendly version of my politics. You know, if God really was involved in something like the downfall of Boris Johnson, why was it so messy and why was it so ugly? And why did it involve so many human beings in darkened rooms, planning and scheming and stabbing people in the back? Why does all of that have to happen in such a conspicuous and sometimes hidden manner, in such a human way, before the end deed actually happens? Why can't it be just a little bit more obvious? But anyway, nobody's seriously claiming that Boris Johnson leaving is an actual miracle. So let's really not dwell too much on that. But what I would like to go, and we discussed this briefly before we hit record proper, so I'm going to jump onto it straight away. Andrew, listeners want to know, we discussed something that happened with you that was supposed to have been a miracle, and we're recording this a week later. Has there been any change? Is there an update that you're going to be able to give us, which helps us to unpick the depths of miracles?
Well, I'll provide an update. I don't know how helpful it'll be, to be honest, but I'll tell about two things that have happened. So my daughter and I went down to the park the day after the attempted healing. So listeners, I ran into a lady from another country who tried to heal me, if you haven't heard the previous episode, and she actually laid her hands on me. I'm sitting on a park bench. She wants to pray for me. I let her pray for me. She puts her hands on me, puts her thumbs over my eyes, and she prays out loud in the park to heal me. The healing failed. Her last statement after the prayer and the recognition that it didn't work, that I still had this prosthetic in my eye, and she can't avoid it, right? Her thumb is over my eye. She can feel the prosthetic. It's very, if that creeps you out, you should have been there. Okay, you should have been me. It was a little off-putting, I don't mind telling you. She says to me, well, you maybe will be better by the time you wake up tomorrow. I'm not better. It's several days further on. We were there the next day. We had a hard time getting the conversation started because obviously I'm not healed, and I don't know what she thinks of that. Am I just a product of Satan that can't be healed? Or is she embarrassed because it didn't work? Or does she want to talk about why it didn't, and she doesn't know how to start the conversation because her English isn't, maybe her English may not be up to the job. Whatever the reason, we had a hard time getting the conversation started the next day, and we never talked about the attempted healing. So that's the second event of the three. The first one being the healing, that being the second. And the third event happened on the way home from the park the day before yesterday. So we're all there together. And we live in the same neighborhood. So my daughter and I walk to the park. She walks to the park with her granddaughter. And we happen to go home the same way. They only live about a block away from us. On the walk home, my daughter says to her granddaughter, would you like to go trick-or-treating with me this year? Now, my daughter's right. Oh boy, does this get good. So my daughter's not quite 3. She has no concept of there might be something wrong with trick-or-treating, right? And this little girl is 6. She's quite a lot older than my daughter. If you think about the difference between a 2-year-old about to be 3 and a 6-year-old, right? There's a lot of education and life experience that make that very different. So my daughter says, hey, do you want to go trick-or-treating with me this year? For no apparent reason except that she's making a friend and she wants to do something fun together.
Right.
Well, the 6-year-old says to my daughter, and I'm leaving the names out because it wouldn't be fair to mention this little girl. This little girl looks at my daughter and says, Halloween is from the devil. And I said, because I don't want to ruin this budding relationship between 2 children. And because my daughter's the only child, I want her to have as many friends as possible because she doesn't have brothers and sisters at home. I mean, I'd want her to have as many friends anyway, but it's particularly important because she's an only child. So I said to the other little girl, to the 6-year-old, I said, yeah, I'm not sure that's true. And she said, you should believe me because my mom told me that Halloween is from the devil. So she doubled down on it. And I just said, yeah, I'm still not sure that's true. And she left it. We walked on together. We have not heard from them again. And I was getting texts several times a day about setting up play dates. And we had firm plans to meet this morning at the park to let the little girls play together. I haven't heard a word. Not a sorry, we're not going to be there. Nothing. It may be too early to read anything into that. But it feels very much from the pattern like they had a conversation about the guy that doesn't agree that Halloween is from the devil. And because they are really devoted to these, to miracles, to princes and principalities, or however you want to phrase that, it seems like they have withdrawn and are not going to communicate further.
Oh, man. Well, first of all, I'm sorry. But the second one reaches and touches so much of my fundamentalist Christian experience that you've just confirmed for them why you weren't healed, because your soul is clearly way too tied to the devil.
Well, I've been thinking that myself anyway. So.
Yeah. I'm trying to work out a way to segue that into Bayes' theorem. And
well, we don't have to go to the math quite so quickly.
What do you think, Brian? How does that?
One thing. When I hear these stories, and even the one with Boris Johnson and just other stories, the way I see it is that you're trying to explain what's going on in the world, and there are some explanations that include outside agents, and there's some that don't. That basically just include the normal workings of the universe or of society or whatever. people have a tendency to see agency when there isn't. There's something about feeling like there's some kind of guidance or control or design in events that is more comforting than thinking that there's a lot of randomness or uncertainty or things just play out the way that they are. And this is true both in the kind of political sphere and also on things like, healings and so on. And that's kind of the core of looking at miracles, is just saying, okay, we have some kind of event, we have a number of explanations for how this could occur, and which ones are kind of the most likely, and how would we know? And this is true in kind of all cases. Some cases are a little harder to control for. I would say anything in kind of politics, it's a lot harder to figure out conclusively what the various causes are because of the complexity. But in the medical fields, healing an eye or any other kind of healing, there are ways we kind of know. We have developed tools in order to distinguish between somewhat random events, the biology just kind of working its way through, and outside agency. That's kind of how I look at all of these sorts of things.
Let's just pretend that it's possible for a second, Brian, that this lady could have prayed for me. Well, I mean, she did pray for me, but she could have prayed for me, and the result of her prayer would have been a healing. So to be very clear, what I mean by healing is that either my prosthetic eye becomes flesh and blood, or the prosthetic eye disappears and that's the fully functioning flesh and blood eye, or my prosthetic pops out and lands on the ground. I've got a flesh and blood eye. However you gloss that.
Right.
I now have 20/20 vision, whatever the result of this supposed healing is, right? But the intent was two good eyes, right?
Right.
So what should I conclude, and how do I get to, in your view? Because I'm going to be all emotionally wrapped up in this, right? I mean, this would be for me a huge life-altering, view-changing kind of event. No matter what I want to think I would do. I don't think there's any way for me to escape the sort of emotional impact that would have, right?
Right.
What should we think if that kind of thing happened? How should I approach?
Well, that's actually, I mean, so in that particular case, right, and I don't know of any case that's close to this, and we can look at some of the specific cases that I've looked at. My assumption is that you probably have some medical records that show that you do not have one of your eyes.
Yeah, that's right. There's an article about me in JAMA way back in like 1970 or so. So Coates disease is how I lost my eye, and I was a very, very early reported case.
Okay.
And so there are even public medical records.
And it's not as if it's an eye that's just not functioning. It's the eye is just simply not there. And so
that's right.
And so then to have a follow-up medical report where you have a functioning eye in any would be incredibly striking, right? And that would be, everyone would probably call that a medical miracle. And it's on par, I would say, with the idea of, why doesn't God cure amputees, right? It's this, whenever God cures something, it always seems to be something that could potentially cure itself or get better on its own, as opposed to like an amputee can't regrow a limb, you can't regrow an eye, right? And there's zero cases of that. And so the point here is, in any of these cases where you essentially have some ailment, you do some treatment, and then you have a result. And most of them are not as striking as what you're proposing, but you could have something where someone doesn't see very well, they have some kind of treatment, and then they see better. And we want to say, did the treatment actually affect things? And in order to know that, we have to establish the proper timeline, that the actual improvement happened in the right temporal order, and also in the right complete shortness of time for that. You also have to rule out other sorts of issues. I mean, it could be that the eyesight got better on its own. It could be that the original measurement was done badly and that was a false negative. So they actually could see better, but it just didn't come out. So there's all these different things. And science has a process for doing that. I mean, the randomized controlled studies, which is kind of the gold standard for medical treatments, is kind of how we rule out all these other, various cases. And we really can't say much if we can't establish those sorts of things. And we can always question whether something kind of a mistake. It's much harder in the case of like an amputee, right? It's really hard to mismeasure an amputation, and it's really hard to mismeasure it having grown back, right? So on both ends of those, the kind of chance for an error is basically zero. And so there was, whether it's the particular event, the prayer, whatever happens to be, or whatever other things you might have had Cheerios for breakfast, that might have done it, right? It'd be harder to tell exactly which thing it was without repetition, but at least it would be something to look at. But in many of the other cases, the original measurements or the final measurements or the timeline are all under question. And that's the sorts of issues that come up.
So from where I am right now, because I haven't been healed, obviously, from where I am now, I still have a question. I have an extended community of amputees. I'm not the only person in the world that has ever lost an eye and has a prosthetic. We are amputees. No, we're not the classic amputee of an arm or a leg, right? But make no mistake about it. There's a body part, an external, obviously missing body part, right? It's an eye rather than a hand, but it's obvious for everyone to see that cares. Okay. So if this kind of thing is healed, and let's just say that let's say the prayer was successful. I still have what I hope, so I want your opinion, Brian, about this kind of question that still remains in my head. How do I get from coincidence or correlation to cause when what we're talking about is a prayer? How do we get to the prayer did the thing?
This is the same thing for any medical treatment at all. If I take some treatment for a headache and that my headache goes away, how did I know that it was the treatment or the headache just was going to go away on its own? And this is why we do randomized controlled studies, right? So essentially the control is that essentially you give some group a placebo and the other group you get the treatment, and you're looking for differences because we know that sometimes things go away on their own. So on a single case, you wouldn't be able to have a strong confidence for that the prayer did it, but you could set up a situation where people are prayed for certain sorts of ailments and then see which ones improve, which ones don't. You have a control set where maybe someone just reads Harry Potter, something like that. There are other kind of ways or doing prayers in other languages. I mean, you could do all sorts of different things with the controls in order to figure that out. And people have done those studies, and in general, they come out negative. In some cases, if the person knows they're being prayed for, the outcomes are actually worse than if they were not prayed for. There's kind of some kind of expectation effect there. But in general, on the large studies that are well controlled, prayer has been shown to be no better than placebo on any of these. That's how you do it. That you'd have to have multiple repetitions. You'd have to have a large sample. And the reason this is necessary is because there are many ways for people to be wrong about things. I mean, there are things that get better on their own. It's obviously, I mean, it was something like an amputation that is a little bit more striking. And there's something where something happened that caused the regrowth of the limb or eye, and it would be interesting to figure out which things it was. So then you would see, okay, what were all the events that happened to this person in the time period, and then control for each one of those. So kind of a subsequent experiment for other people to kind of rule out or to figure out whether it was prayer or some other thing that caused the regrowth. And that's what you would have to do.
Matthew, what are your thoughts? I've got some, but you've been very patient.
Well, if you wanted to stay on that topic, ask away, because I was wanting to talk about specific studies because Brian brought up that magic word, and the obvious one that goes to, and our friends over at the Unbelievable radio show and podcast have mentioned this study multiple times. And this is the one in Mozambique in the 80s or 90s, I think it was, where people received intercessory prayer and allegedly had hearing loss reversed. So I wanted to direct it and ask specifics about that study because it's well reported on the internet. So unless you don't mind me going there, and
No,
ask
I don't,
your thing
because
away.
there's not anything else to my story. And if we keep digging into it, look, we're not going to be any further along by continuing to carve this out. And Brian, thank you for going through that answer, because that's largely where I live. Even if I were healed, barring the emotional commitment to the healing, which I wouldn't deny that I would have, right? The rational part of me, and presuming that would eventually resurface, I hope that it would. I hope that I would get away from the emotional commitment eventually. The rational part of me should surely say, as a one-off, this isn't an explanation, it's an oddity. Now, look, it's an oddity that did me great good, right? But we don't get to anything like a cause and effect relationship. I know that's sort of a tired phrase, right? But we don't get to causation. We still only have correlation as far as I can tell.
When I look into these things, I see them actually as looking into miracles or any extraordinary claims, UFOs, whatever. I see it as a two-step process. I see the first step is to ask, is there anything interesting even to look at here without talking about causes or anything else, and to see whether something would raise to that level. And then once it raises above that level, then we can talk about how can we figure out causation and so on. And so far, none of the miracle claims that I've looked into have even risen to the level of there's something more interesting going on here. There are enough kind of holes in the data, missing things, things that haven't been established, or mundane explanations that work just as well, that there really isn't anything more interesting. The same thing for UFOs. And there was actually a report, I think it was in the 1970s, that the government did on UFOs, and it was called the Condon Report. And they and their final kind of summary was, after looking at pretty much every piece of data throughout the 1940s all the way through the 70s, that there wasn't anything interesting there, right? And that was the kind of conclusion. So you don't even need to get to causation if you can't get over that first hurdle. And this also deals with I would say, the most common retort to people looking at miracles that the theists give, and they'll say that there is some a naturalistic bias or anti-supernatural bias by the skeptic in looking at miracles. And when I think of things in kind of a two-step process, the first step has nothing to do with whether it's supernatural or natural or anything. It's just simply saying, like, is there anything interesting here? And if it doesn't raise above that, I don't even need to worry about any kind of naturalistic bias on my part. The Mozambique study is a great example of kind of what not to do.
Would you like to expand on that, please?
Yeah, you can tell me about the Mozambique study, because I don't know this one.
It comes up an awful lot. When I did,
it does.
I discussed it a couple of years ago when I did an episode here with a couple of Christians, and that particular study came up. And I know Unbelievable has mentioned it at least once, probably twice. And when you do searching for miracles, this particular study comes up. So a lot of Christians put an awful lot of stock into this, and they seem to take it very, very seriously. So let's break that one down then.
Yeah, and so this study comes from around September of 2010. And there's a paper, and you can actually get the full text of it. And the title is Study of the Therapeutic Effects of Proximal Intercessory Prayer on Auditory and Visual Impairments in Rural Mozambique. And their conclusions was that the rural Mozambique subjects exhibited improved audition and or visual acuity subsequent to the intercessory prayer. And they say the magnitude of the measured effects exceeds that reported in previous suggestion, and so on. And then it says future studies seem to be warranted. That's the basic idea. We can provide links for this. I was on an episode back in February on the Digital Gnosis website on their YouTube channel with Nathan, James, and Camille, and we were looking at as many of the common miracle claims that came up. And I have a blog post that I could also provide the link for, talking about a long discussion about miracles, because the episode went on about 10 hours, going through a lot of different claims. And the Mozambique one came up. I think the best response to this one is from a link in Stephen Novella's website, where he does a lot of evidence of various sorts of treatments. Basically, it said, like, imagine that you had a study with 24 subjects, and there were no controls, and there was no blinding. Like, everyone knew that they were getting the treatment, that there were multiple interventions of the treatment if it was not initially effective, and that all the subjects demonstrated some kind of improvement from this intervention. The subjects were not chosen randomly. They were self-selected from people who already believed that the treatment would work, and that prior attempts to do this, but the authors don't disclose the data, showed no effect. All right, so they only posted this one where they show an actual effect, and it's an N of 24 subjects. Regardless of the treatment, you would never believe a medical paper that had such low N, that had no controls, that the treatment itself was very social in the sense that someone was right there physically, like touching you. You have a group, and you have all these psychological things that can be going on. As far as study design, it's absolutely terrible. And the effect sizes are modest, and bad data was simply thrown out. It doesn't matter what the treatment is, whether it's prayer, whether that was homeopathy, whether there was some new, you would just like discount this as anything, which to me calls into question actually the journal that it was published in and the standards that it has for this sort of thing. Is that it really is extremely badly designed.
Do either of you, just for now, when you went through the actual title of the study, I was like, oh yeah, I've heard this. But do you recall the journal that published it? It seems like it was a journal in Africa, that it wasn't a Western journal. Am I wrong about that?
It's a Southern Medical Journal.
Southern Medical Journal, okay.
Yeah.
This is not, we would never accept a drug trial done this way.
No, never.
Right. I mean, my question for any Christians that are listening, there probably aren't any, but if there are any listening, my open question is, why does this kind of thing feel compelling to those people that have faith that this kind of thing can happen? I want to understand the mindset that says this seems compelling to me religiously, but I would never accept a pharmaceutical that was offered to me in the same way. Now, if you're a big vitamin taker, okay, you need not apply as the answer to this question. Okay, if you're taking Wolfsbane at night, don't send me an email.
Well, I think a lot of people don't look at the details, right? You know, that they'll see it published, they'll see it's a science journal, it has a really fancy title, and they won't look at the fact that it may not be well designed, that the testimony doesn't mean much, and I think a lot of people don't recognize how much scientists go out of their way to rule out alternate explanations other than the one that they might think is actually true. And this was something that surprised me when I was a graduate student. I was in the physics program. My research was in computational neuroscience. I was going to a lot of neuroscience talks. And in physics, you don't generally have to have a lot of controls because there are theories that predict very conclusively and accurately what your results will be like. So you don't tend to have this idea of controls. There's not quite as much randomness. In biology, things can be quite a mess. And one of the things that surprised me in talk after talk and in neuroscience was that someone would say, okay, we did this measurement. We think it's this, like, we did this treatment and the response went up by a certain amount. And that would be like the first 10 minutes. And then the next like half an hour would be, well, maybe it was because of this. So we did this extra experiment to kind of rule that one out. Or maybe it was like this other idea. And so we did a separate experiment to rule that one out. And so this whole list of things that went on far longer than the original claim. And then the final conclusion was like, yeah, here's the, we think it's this the first thing that we kind of presented. And we've ruled out, A, B, and C. And almost always, especially early in the project, someone in the audience would be, did you think about C and D and E and so on? And they're like, oh no, I didn't. Okay, that'll be my next 6 months of like ruling out those. And I don't think that's appreciated as much in the public as like this happens all the time for anything we do in science, and that we don't settle for the first thing that we think is going to be the case. We look for ways to control for that. And the fact that this study, for example, doesn't do that in the slightest and is satisfied with a really low number, given that you could do this treatment to thousands if you wanted to, right? It's not like the fact they have 24 is not a limitation of the method. Like sometimes some methods are hard to do in large numbers. This is not one of them. And so the fact that they don't do that they are not interested in doing that, perhaps.
That's a fabulous point, and I see that an awful lot in discussions. The accusation of I'm just being hyper skeptical and I've got an anti-religious bias, when actually what I'm trying to do is ask questions to eliminate what you've just said. Let's try to eliminate other things, because then we can hone in on we can rule out what it's not, so we can get a closer idea of what it might be. And it's all part of narrowing down the criteria and trying to work out what it is. And I think too many people don't appreciate the amount of work and the amount of thinking that scientists do on that. And I think it's probably an education task to do that. That might not be the scientist's job to educate the public on that, but somehow that kind of message needs to go out to the public, in that when you're criticizing or critiquing or thinking about whether or not to accept a proposal, there's a whole criteria of thinking that you need to go through before you actually land at your conclusion.
I'd also add that Stephen Novella pointed out that this is actually what he sees as a larger trend, that clinical research going backwards in quality after like high quality studies yield negative results. So you do a really good, the prayer studies are basically then negative. And so having a lower quality study show a positive effect is what's being pushed, because the larger studies basically show a negative result. And he says that he sees this with acupuncture, he sees this with homeopathy, the same trend, where essentially you test it well, there's no effect, and then the proponents of it put forward these small, less controlled, lower quality tests for the same thing. And it's the same kind of idea.
The thing that gets me as a non-scientist, when I read a research study, and there's always a section in the paper that talks about how the study was done, and about how they try to control for things that might invalidate the results. It is hard for a non-professional, or at least this particular non-professional me, to decide whether the study is done well. It is not a trivial task to me to read a research study and say, well, that looks like it was done well, because as I understand it, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, this field, there's still development to some extent about how to do really good research studies.
Well, I think there is always a challenge of designing a research study to rule out various alternative explanations. I see that theists is actually being lazy here. They don't seem to want to put in the work. And one of my favorite examples, the double-blind acupuncture studies, which on the face of it, you're wondering, how the heck can you possibly do a double-blind acupuncture study, given that you're sticking needles into somebody, right? And so how do you make it sure that the person giving the treatment doesn't know, and the person getting the treatment doesn't know, right? And I know, like, for me, when I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, that's just going to be impossible. Like there's no way you could do that. But then someone came up with a very clever mechanism, which uses a pen-like mechanism where you kind of push a little button, and then the needle comes out just a tiny amount, like an eighth of an inch or something out of the end, or not. Right. And it's so small that you wouldn't be able to tell really as the practitioner or the person getting it. Right. And that's and when they, and which is very clear. So they basically make some of them fail, the control cases. Right. And someone else knows, which pens work and which ones don't. And then they do the experiment. And lo and behold, what happens is the effect goes away. Or you can show that where there's an effect, it doesn't matter where you stick the needle. So the entire idea of acupuncture falls apart. Right. But that's like, wow, that's really clever. Someone did the work to come up with a clever way to do this. And the thing is, with prayer, it would be so easy. It is incredibly easy to come up with ways of doing this and to show it. But the work has not really been done, because I don't think it's like they don't want to, in some ways. They don't want to accept that there's possibly a negative answer on the other end of that experiment.
Again, for the listeners, this particular conversation, miracles, how to research miracles, and then writing about researching miracle claims. Brian is an old hand at this, and for my taste, has written some of the best work from a professional scientist perspective on how to get behind some of these miracle claims, to look at them and assess them, and really, really encourage you to go through the links that'll be in the show notes and read Brian's writings. I thought that I understood some of this stuff pretty well. Brian has helped me immensely. So Brian, thank you. One of the things that I found interesting in reading your back and forth with Jonathan McClatchy, so we're shifting gears for a moment to your writings specifically, there's a miracle claim, and you were doing the research on the miracle claim. And as it turns out, the claimed healing took place long after the actual attempt to heal the person, and the published bit made it appear as if they coincided quite closely temporally.
Ooh, that's sneaky.
Do you remember that particular case?
Yes, I believe this was the instantaneous resolution of juvenile macular degeneration blindness after proximal intercessory prayer, and this was one of the cases. So when I had a discussion with Jonathan McClatchy on this podcast, he and I had said that there has not been a verified miracle claim even since Hume's original essay. Jonathan told me two of them in that episode. One of them was this case of the macular degeneration. Another one was a gastroparesis healing. Both cases, the timeline is suspect, and there really isn't a good causal connection. Whenever you look for those two, you actually do find the Mozambique one as well. Those three came up, at least for me in my searches, all the time, and they kept coming up. And we looked at all three of these cases in that really long episode on digital gnosis, and I wrote the post on a long discussion of miracles, and we'll get the link for that. And I posted the original, so you can actually find the original documents for these the studies, so you can verify anything that we go through. And they have a timeline where there are long gaps between the events. I think this one is decades between that, and there's questions about the original diagnosis, there's questions about and so on. So there's a lot of issues with this particular study. They do I get this study quoted quite a lot. What's interesting, actually, I think on that episode someone brought up that there's a mismatch between the magnitude of the claim, and essentially the claim says, like, after being blind, which she actually wasn't completely blind. She was suddenly could see perfectly, but the actual test shows she couldn't see perfectly. So, like, the kind of magnitude of the claim, there's a disconnect between that and the attention they pay to documenting it. And so if you thought you were miraculously healed, right, you wouldn't have waited a couple of years to get tested. I mean, I would have gone, like, the next morning to get tested for something like that. Sure. If I felt like I was blind and suddenly I could see, I'd be like, get me a doctor's appointment right now, get me a vision test so I can see whether this effect is real or transient, or if it goes away. I mean, any of that. But that doesn't seem to happen, that there are long gaps between the claimed intercessory prayer or the treatment and the effect. And in that time, the story gets magnified. And this is actually the same effect I've seen a lot in cases of UFO sightings. There's a great example of a UFO sighting in Rendlesham Forest, where there's a huge difference between the original reports and the later reports. There's a classic case of Barney and Betty Hill of an alien abduction, again, where that occurs over years. And you can see, there's because the therapy sessions with them have been documented. You actually see their changes in story across the time. And some of it has actually influenced our current popular depictions of aliens. So you get the same effect whenever you have these long gaps, which is why it's so important to establish the timeline very concretely. And in any study, you need to have a short time between treatment and measuring the effect, or else you can't really, there could be a million other events in between that then you have to control for. So part of making your kind of controlling for other possibilities easier is to make the time between the treatment and the measured effect be as small as you possibly can.
Right. And so it's not actually the case that it's impossible for some sort of long time lapse to happen. It's just the case that you can't pin the one to the other, or at least the further away they are from each other, the harder it is to link the one to the other.
Exactly. You'd have to have many more controls. You'd have to figure out what else could have happened. It also means that, like, if this is anything that could get better on its own over time, you've increased the time that could have happened. And so that's another case. Another one is, and this happened, I think, in the gastroparesis one. And there was a prayer. This person had suffered from a long, time. There was a prayer, and suddenly that, it was one of these things where they couldn't eat at all for like 16 years, and then there was a prayer, and then suddenly they could eat. But the problem was they never tested whether he could eat in between in that entire 16 years, and or at least no documentation of it. So it could have been that he was already cured before the prayer, but because the timeline wasn't specified, you can't really say that the prayer actually did it, because he could have this particular problem in some cases goes away after a few years, and if they never bothered to test it after that, then it could have already gotten better on its own. So again, this is not establishing the timeline is part of not establishing good controls, not figuring out what alternative explanations there could be in someone.
I've got to tell you, a couple of minutes ago, you said something about they thought they were healed. This was talking about Mac DGen, and you said that you would get tested the next day if you thought you were healed. I've got to tell you that I was hurting myself not to laugh out loud. And the reason is, if the effect is so small that you're not sure,
yes.
Can you really say that this was, I've been healed? It's a miracle, and the effect is so small that I'm not worried about it.
Well, they claim that it's a big effect, right? In that case with macular degeneration, she actually claimed that, she was blind and then she could see clearly. Like it went for, it was that dramatic, and yet her actions don't seem to reflect that.
I'm not sure what I would do. Like if I were healed today. So this is going to sound like playing devil's advocate for a moment, and maybe it is. I'm not doing it deliberately. It's just the thing that comes to mind. If this lady at the park had healed me, I wonder, would I go tell my eye doctor? I mean, so I think that I would certainly keep my eye appointments in the future, right? So there's no question about that. If I suddenly had another eye. Most people know that the one that I have doesn't work particularly well, right? My vision's something like 20/400, which means that what you guys see at a football field plus away, I can't see until I'm 20 feet from it, right? Don't let me drive. So with these kinds of things, I don't know if I would run off to the doctor right away and say, hey, I've been healed. But certainly I would keep my regular eye appointments, because wouldn't I want to protect that newly found vision as long as possible?
Right.
So I don't know, a slight bit of devil's advocate, and if you want to push back there, certainly feel free.
It's hard to guess what one would do, but I think if you completely regrew an eye, that would be so remarkable that I don't know. I would feel like I'd want to go to see an eye doctor just to see be like, what the heck happened here? Was like, and one thing is that, obviously there's always the worry, I think, of doctors in cases, and I think this was brought up, that if there is a miracle healing, right, of some kind, if that actually existed, then doctors might get sued for malpractice basically because they would say that the original diagnosis was wrong. But if you actually had the scans, then it's pretty obvious that there's no eye there, and now there is, right? And that's the sort of thing. Yeah, it's I guess it's hard to tell. But I think if it's not something quite like a limb growing back, if your eyesight suddenly got better, I would want to go to my eye doctor, just be like, what the heck's happening here? I had perfect vision all my life until recently, in the last 10 years or so, and I've had to have reading glasses, it's the classic, just getting older sort of thing.
Right.
If
Vitreal fluid and all of that.
Right. Yeah. If I woke up tomorrow and suddenly I could see perfectly, I would go to the eye doctor immediately, because I'd be worried that something else was going on, and that was affecting my vision. It happened to be better, but any sudden change like that is of some kind of concern. It makes you wonder what causes it. So I would hope that if I had a sudden improvement in vision, that I would actually want to see my doctor sooner than later, and not wait for years to see.
Well, there's one more problem here, I think, that So I mentioned earlier that I live in an extended community of other people that are amputees, people that have lost eyes, and that usually means that you know somebody that's lost an arm or a leg or whatever. And I know lots of these people. Here's another effect that I don't see in the miracle claim data. This one, perhaps it's more of a thing that bothers me at a societal level. If someone healed me, so this lady at the park keeps coming up because this is part of my recent experience, right? Had she healed me, you can bet your last dollar that I would ask her to heal my other friends who are amputees.
Yes.
You can bet your last dollar. I wouldn't just ask her. I would beg her on bent knee. I would offer to pay her. I would make sure she got paid if I couldn't pay her. And this is the thing that I really, where are the stadiums of people that get together every year and say, I was healed? Where is their newsletter that they send out to other amputees saying, God is so good. He is so beneficent. He is so kind and generous and so concerned about us as humans and our condition that he has provided this faith healer, and they're going to be at the Louisiana Superdome on Saturday, whatever. Come all ye who labor and are heavy laden.
Well,
why don't they where that is?
Well, why don't they just hang out in the emergency room?
Well, see, yeah. Right. Children's cancer wards, right? Yeah. But
if that's the case.
Yeah. But this is the thing that bothers, that kind of thing really does bother me. Had she healed me, we'd line up around the block.
Yeah, what's interesting, actually, and I've heard this response before when they're talking about miracles, is they say miracles aren't replicable, right? So when we talk about testing miracles, they're not replicable, right? And I've heard this, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, either it works or it doesn't, and these papers are actually claiming that they're replicable, right? That's actually
right.
The entire claim. Right. So if they are replicable, that means they're testable, and one should. If you actually think it's true, you should be able to easily demonstrate that. And so I feel like, and maybe it's also one of these things, maybe there is some kind of self-sealing kind of thought process going on, which happens a lot of times. So it happens with like the ESP, for example, they'll say things like, the effect disappears when skeptics try to look at it. Right? And and I've heard this with, ESPs and psychic claims and so on, that they'll say, well, I mean, if you're psychic, then it disrupts the whole energy balance and it's not going to work. You could also say you can't test God. So the second you start, making an experiment, he's going to, bow out of that and so on. But which is really just from a science point of view, saying, oh, well, that's kind of a cop out. And we've seen this in other cases, when something doesn't work and you simply make excuses after it's demonstrated not to work. And because that if it did actually work and was a real effect and was replicable, they would be shouting this, on the rooftops, and they'd be publishing it everywhere, right? And the thing is that they're not. And that to me is telling. And the best you get, and that was when we were in conversation with Jonathan McClatchy, and the best cases they ever bring up are these same ones that are published in dubious journals or have dubious methodology, and they keep coming up again and again and again, and it's the same ones, and there's just not any effort to make them better, or the ones that have been done better have shown a negative effect.
Right. What I hear when a Christian makes this particular, if someone says to me, it's not replicable because you can't test God, so the skeptic need not apply, right? Because skeptics don't get healings. Right. What I hear is this. So the more skeptics there are in the world, the less powerful your God is. Mm-hmm. Not very charitable, I realize. And maybe it's overstatement. Right. The more skeptics there are in the world, the less your God does. Maybe its power is not diminished. Okay, fine. Right. You can believe that, and we can even have that conversation. But if there were 100% skeptics in the world, there would no longer be miracle claims? Is that really what we're saying? Because that seems to be orthogonal to what a God mission would be if he was really a personal, all-loving God.
Right.
Skepticism shouldn't stop him from working.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And I think part of certainly in terms of from the Christian perspective, the whole concept of the scientific method and critical thinking and eliminating untrue options isn't part of the Christian message. That's just not part of the way Christianity works. Christianity is so built on the emotional story, the testimony, this wonderful thing happened. And that's because of the way that Christianity is and the context in which these stories are told. They're always told in their purest, most brilliant light. And that's never quite the whole story, and it's never quite the whole truth either. And Christians, and I've noticed this in myself, as Christians and in my own old Christian days, we're so geared around these wonderful, uplifting stories. The idea of questioning it feels like the antithesis of the whole point of being there. And so the due diligence to test these things simply doesn't happen. A good story that I can remember is going back to my teenage years. It's back to the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl explosion. And those of us of a certain age remember it really well. And I remember a conversation my dad was having with a Christian pastor friend of ours in Zambia. And he was telling a story about some farmers in Europe, and some of them were Christians. And he'd heard this story. And what it was they were testing these farms with Geiger counters to see which ones were affected by the radiation. And they got to this farm and they were testing the fields on this farm, and there was zero reading, but all the neighboring farms around it had a reading. And it's lo and behold, this farm, which allegedly had zero readings from the Geiger counters, belonged to a Christian. And hey, I'm wonderful, a miracle. And I lapped it up and I believed it for years. And yet you're rightly laughing, Brian, because it just sounds so ridiculous. And I know it was pre the days of when the internet was just everywhere, but I have tried really, really hard to find a reference to that story, and I can't find it anywhere. And so it's just one of these urban legends, and Christianity is utterly jam-packed full of these kinds of urban legends. It's just one of these urban legends that somehow found its way to where I was living in Zambia. Goodness knows how it got there. And it just spread around, and there's probably people who still believe it now, and no one ever tests it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a power to the kind of testimony, and that's the thing that, and for a scientist, testimony is some of the weakest evidence for something, but for many theists, the story is the important thing. When we talk about miracles, I think we also have to talk about Craig Keener's tome on miracles. I call it tome. It's like 700, 800 pages or something like that of miracle claims, right? So these are not, established miracles. They are miracle claims. And the thing is, whenever you look into any of the specific claims, one finds either you can't find the data at all, in which case you can't do anything, or you find these sorts of it's not controlled. There are mundane explanations. The story could have been made up, of just all sorts of things. I think people's reaction when they see Keener's book is like, wow, at least one of these must be true in this almost 700 pages. And there's almost this argument from big book, right? So I'm not going to bother reading it, but someone went through and it must be true because someone wrote a big book about it. And but every time I've seen Keener present any of the miracles, they're all really, they're all terrible. I mean, they're all they're just anecdotes. They have various plausible explanations. They're never in any kind of controlled setting, and it really is the fact that there's so many miracle claims and none of them get replicated is a real problem. To me, I see Keener's book as actually a great evidence against miracles, because you would think that if the miracle claims are that common and you haven't been able to demonstrate any of them, that's the telltale sign that there's nothing there.
It seems bizarre to me to say that there are lots and lots and lots of these miracles, right? So I've read that volume, every page. I've got the ebook. And what seems strange to me is on the back of all of these kinds of claims, we still have this defense that miracles aren't replicable. So what I'm saying is, what does that actually mean? Because it certainly seems that there should be something replicable, right? There's some kind of faith that you should have to have There's something about the person or their circumstances or the kind of life that they lead that should make a miracle replicable. And if it's not, if miracles really aren't replicable, shouldn't that tell us something about the character of the God that has miracles, and he won't provide a replicable method of intercession? That has its own implications to me. What do you guys think?
Right. Well, actually, we can quote Keener on this, which I think is pretty interesting. So on one of the videos, and this was one of the ones we went through in the 9-hour episode, but he said, quote, "They're not replicable, but if there's a pattern like 9 times out of 10 where this happens, it's in the context of prayer, that should say something," end quote. So that to me is saying, on one side he says they're not replicable, but on the other side there's a pattern. So that means it's replicable. It's in some way you can repeat it because you can reproduce the context. And then if you remove you make an experiment, you remove the context and the miracles disappear, then that's then you figure it out. But it seems very odd that on the one hand he says you can't repeat them, but on the other hand he says that there could be patterns. And so I think what it is, I think there's this funny dissonance here where they want to be able to say you can't repeat it because when people try to repeat it, they don't get any result. They also want to say that it's part of a larger theological pattern and that, God is acting in the world in some predictable way towards some, with some purpose. And so that there should be some context that the prayer actually does something and that it's not completely random. So they want to be able to say that prayer is not random. They also want to say that the miracles are not repeatable, and in some way they're holding both of those conflicting ideas in their head at the same time.
So I'm a former Christian. Matthew, you're a former Christian. Brian, Catholic? Do I remember that correctly? Okay, I just wanted to make sure before I pinned that one on you.
Former Catholic.
Former,
so
right?
Just to be clear.
I was in a cult. I don't, I've been honest about this. I was in a cult. The very strange thing to me is that Christians are teaching some notion. Now, this is what you were saying, and this is just me coming alongside because I'm baffled. But I held these ideas in contradiction in my own head at some point in the past, and lots of people did. The idea that Christianity will teach Christians to pray, that somehow prayer does have to do with replicability, even if you preach the sermon from the pulpit, that God's going to work his will. And so you can't know what God is going to give you. Maybe he has a plan for you because you are an amputee or because you have schizophrenia or whatever. God's got a plan. So he's not going to. There's some expectation of replicability, of non-randomness. Otherwise, we would tell people to throw up their hands. Wouldn't you? If it was really not replicable, would you tell people to pray for it?
Well, the people who believe in God's plan do not think that praying actually does something, like God's just going to do whatever he's going to do, but that somehow the prayer kind of connects them with God in some personal way, but they're not influencing the future. So but they are very quick to interpret good things and only good things to the agent, the actions of God, the external agent, and it's only the good things. And then that's the other part is not recognizing all of the negative results. So if you think of prayer as being, even in the uncontrolled case, so many people pray and most of those prayers don't go answered in any way, or they say that the answer is either yes, no, or maybe. And so after the fact they'll look at only the good things and they ignore all the cases where the prayer didn't work or didn't have any at least obvious case for that. And that's kind of, in a sense, part of the controls, right? You want to say, when I pray, this happens. When I don't pray, something else happens, right? But if essentially the various events in the world happen regardless of whether you pray or not, that should tell you something. And I think theists like to cherry pick a lot of the results.
And what else is there other than yes, no, or maybe?
Right, exactly.
What else is left? This is another frustration because it's just counting the hits and ignoring the misses because there are no misses. Yes, no, and maybe covers the whole board.
And I think that was a really big clue in the way that Christians think this through. And that came up in the last episode that we recorded together, Andrew, literally only a week ago. And that was when we were talking about the evidence for the resurrection, because Christians see that as the greatest, most significant miracle of all time. And the Christians on that podcast that we were reviewing, they opened it up by saying, before I can get people to accept the idea of a miracle, I first need to get them to accept the idea of God. And I think that's the thing, because once you've accepted the idea of this thing that can literally do anything, then the barrier to accepting that this thing that I can't explain has happened in a way that I can't explain becomes really, really easy, really, really plausible. And the motivation to look for ways in which it might just be natural simply evaporates because you've got this being in mind that can do it if they wish.
So that's interesting.
There is also a problem, though, Matthew, with that. And that is just because you believe miracles can happen doesn't mean that you believe any particular miracle has happened. I mean, we have claims of Islamic miracles. We have claims about, and obviously, Jews don't believe that the resurrection happened, right? And yet they are not closed to miracles. So it is true that once you have an agent that can do anything, then pretty much, everything is on the table. But you also then have to have some knowledge of what the motivations of that agent is in order to even make any statement about, why they would make this happen versus that happening.
And what would convince you to? So it's an interesting kind of question. Before you talk about miracles, you should first establish that there's a God that can do anything. Okay, this sounds a bit like double talk to me because it makes me ask, how would you establish that there is a God that could do anything without some demonstration that he could do anything? I have no idea. It sounds like it sounds like well, I don't know what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like something plausible to me that there's a way to, other than argument, other than trying to build some logical construct that is entirely hypothetical. What would it take for you guys to believe that there's a God that can do anything? How would you? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but I was just saying, this is why I like to think of this topic and researching miracles in and any extraordinary claims as that two-step process. There's the first step to see, is there anything interesting to look at here? And then the next one is to look at plausible explanations for that event once you've established that there's kind of something to look at there. And so I'm not going to talk about what would convince me of aliens before I establish that any of the UFO claims have any useful indication that there's an external agent causing these, right? I also don't need an anti-alien bias to examine the case of someone's UFO claims. Just look at, it's like, okay, was there a lighthouse in the distance? Was Venus in the sky at the same? Okay, that's probably what it was. You haven't demonstrated anything, interesting to look at. I don't need to talk about aliens about that. And so the same thing for miracles is that, every time I've looked at them, it's always been, so at the first, it's always like, oh, look, this person got healed of blindness, right? And then you look at the details and well, they weren't really blind originally. They marginally improved, and you haven't established a timeline, and you haven't done any of that. So there's nothing really to look at. I'm not even going to talk about whether there's a God or not, or what other agents or aliens or anything in order to try to explain that, because there's just simply nothing to explain. And so I think that's kind of where I come. And you could ask the question, what would, so if you imagine that sorts of miracles could happen, right? And what sorts of observations would convince me? And I would say anything that would convince me of extraordinary events that happen in the sciences at any point, right? So like, what would convince me of proton decay or something like that, right? And even though I might not be an expert, it's that like I want to see in kind of agreed upon process that they follow the methodology that they controlled for all these things, or something like faster than light travel or anything. I would want to see how the controls were all done, and so
Sure.
far none of. And what bothers me sometimes is theists will say like, well, you wouldn't even believe it if someone came in, you had chopped off their head and they walked in the next day, whatever. It's like, well, none of the claims that you're saying are even remotely like that. So why should I even entertain it? None of the claims I've looked at raise to the level of something is actually interesting happening, and that's the point. They're generally one-offs that are really controlled, marginal effects, and they haven't established a timeline.
Matthew, you've been very patient.
No, it's quite all right. You say all the stuff that I want to say before I say it, so it's perfectly good. I'm sure the audience are enjoying hearing you more than me for once in an episode.
Actually, what everybody in the audience just said was, right, tell him to shut up. I'm pretty sure that's what they said. They hear your voice, they hear my voice, and they want me to shut up.
There is a claim, though, specifically about Christianity that is floating around. And I hope you won't mind me name dropping him. I'm going to have to tag him on Twitter when this episode goes out. But Robert L. White, who has been on this episode briefly, the one I was talking about earlier about miracles, and he does his own podcast occasionally, and he's talked about miracles. He loves talking about miracles. And his very specific claim is that Christianity has a much higher concentration of miracle claims than any of the other religions. So surely that has got to count as a plus point for Christianity and the veracity of its claims.
Well, I'd have to see the data on that first. I'm not sure if I would believe even that claim. Second thing is, I would say something like, let's say something like Buddhism, right? Buddhism doesn't make any claims about miracles because they just simply don't. That's just not part of the religion. Whereas it does seem to be the case for Christianity. And I imagine that there are other things that are predicted in other religions that are not part of Christian theology that happen more often in those other religions than in Christianity. And so just because Christianity has miracles as part of their storyline, and then, by the way, Christians talk about miracles a lot more, it doesn't really impress me all that much.
Okay.
And I think there are selection effects here. So I think I said this to Robert, Matthew. There are a couple of things. First of all, we are somewhat predisposed in our society to talk more about Christianity than any other religion anyway. So I think there's just a frequency bias here. There's also a language barrier. To what degree do single language speakers get exposed to miracle claims from Eastern religions? Just as a for instance, if you don't speak an Eastern language, how are you even going to do that research? And so I said this, I think at the time, that it strikes me, I'm not saying that the research can't be done. That is not at all what I'm saying. We have plenty of people in the world that are multilingual that can do this kind of research. It's not the kind of research I could do. And when I asked him about this, I didn't receive the kind of response that said, oh, yes, well, this was done by some multilingual, person interested in theology that, I didn't get that kind of answer. And so I'm still somewhat convinced that even the language barrier creates a selection pressure here that was not accounted for in that conversation.
It was also brought up in that long discussion on miracles. Camille had made a point that testimonies of different religions only reflect what that particular religion has as a theological component. So, for example, near-death experiences are only reported in religions that support dualism, and recalled past memories from past lives only occurs within religions that support reincarnation. And so you could say something like, other religions that like Hinduism, for example, they have way more events of people having past memories from past lives. So maybe that must mean that that's true, right? So that's the argument that's being made. And he also made the point, it's like, why aren't there miracle claims of people spontaneously generating electricity? Right, and it's like this, which is like nowhere in any theological area. I mean, all like that question is easily answered under kind of naturalistic assumptions, but it's certainly not expected under theism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point though about these things only being reported in cultures that accept the basic assumption that's underneath it. I hadn't appreciated that, but that's a really good thing that's worth pointing out. And that also then probably explains why Christianity sees so many near-death experiences reported, because we see those being reported as evidence for God as well. Do you classify them in the same bucket as miracles, or do you classify them slightly differently? And have you looked at any?
I've looked at it a little bit, but that digital Gnosis Bad Apologetics has one specifically going through near-death experiences, and it's at least as long as the episode I was on. I wasn't on that particular episode, but none of the near-death experiences have risen to the bar of anything that is at all interesting. I mean, and so I haven't looked into them all that much, just mostly because there's nothing that really seems to rise to the level that I would consider to be interesting.
Right. Stick on that subject very briefly. There is one that I know I've heard Gary Habermas publicize very recently, and I've heard somebody else on another podcast talk about the same story, and I think it's actually the woman who's involved in it. And the way she tells it, even as a skeptic, is very convincing, but I'm also very much aware that there is some bias there, but I'm just not quite sure exactly how to identify it. But it's basically, the synopsis is about identifying a shoe on the roof of the building and then reporting the shoe to somebody when she woke up and them going and finding it. So that's the essence of the story, but she tells it in much more colourful detail than that, and I don't really know how to fact check any of those details, so there's nowhere I can go with the information in the story.
Yeah, it is a little tough. I mean, in some cases, you just don't have enough information. There were a few unbelievable episodes on miracles where someone made some, medical claim, and I tried to look for the data. I was never able to find it. And it is hard because a lot of times the stories get changed over time, and you only get the changed version. You can't really backtrack to the original. So sometimes they're actually very hard to. I'd have to look back at the near-death experience episode on that YouTube channel to see whether they talk about that particular one. I don't recall. I remember that story roughly, but I don't recall the specifics of it.
Right.
Now I'm asking your question though, Brian. It's so hopefully the person that made this claim never hears me say this, but what makes that interesting? All right. So there's a shoe on a building. Lots of shoes, lots of buildings in this world. I'm sure that people have lost shoes. I'm not trying to be dismissive. I promise you I'm not. But what about that story helps along the idea of a near-death experience? It seems so commonplace that it can't help the rather extraordinary claim that's being made.
I think the idea with all of the near-death experiences is that if the person could potentially have received information while they were supposedly dead, and then came back with that information, then what would have, that would indicate that somehow they were outside of their body at that time. That's the idea. So people will test that. They'll have things like the
cards on top of the shelves.
Exactly, right. The numbers or the digital readout or something like that. And that's the...
I guess I'm just doomed to offer all the skeptical tropes in this episode, but I'll offer this one too. Okay, so fine, you had a near-death experience. You saw the shoe on top of the building. You had somebody go and look, and lo and behold, it was a shoe, and it was uncommon, and yada yada yada. Right. So somehow this helps your claim. Okay, fine. So I'll just give you all of that ground. What else does it tell us that is worthwhile about a God? So is this really what your God is good for? You have a near-death experience, and what he gave you was a shoe.
It's a little weak, but it's the idea that they are somehow having it gives indication, I guess, that there's experience beyond your mental, your kind of beyond the brain. So essentially,
Right.
it's a data point towards dualism. It doesn't really get you toward Christianity specifically, but it's a data point toward dualism.
Right. Doesn't help you understand the God in question, as far as I can tell. I understand the dualist point, though. I'm not dismissing that there could be important events and information that might lead us toward dualism. I'm not dismissing that at all. It just seems to me that if there's a God that wants us to recognize through near-death experiences that there's something more out there, the near-death experience should bring us back something that helps us understand what that is.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's the same thing for alien abductions, right? So it's like these people get abducted by aliens, but they never bring back anything that they themselves couldn't have known or plausibly guessed. And so it's just, and even like the early literature that's gone through in Carl Sagan's book, A Demon Haunted World, he talks about some of the early ones where, like in the 1940s and 50s or 1950s, there was the alien abductions. The aliens warned people about nuclear war, but they didn't warn them about, say, bioterrorism, right? So it's always about whatever they happen to already know. And the same thing happens with the near-death experiences. What they see generally is a total reflection of what they themselves already expect. And that's, and it's never anything that is kind of beyond that.
Right. And these aliens that perform operations on these poor unfortunate abductees, they're always so competent. They never make any mistake and leave some evidence behind that they've had a rummage around. There's never a scalpel left inside or a mopping pad or whatever.
Yeah, they're all very good.
But going back to the whole near-death experience thing and the dualism on that, that even if it doesn't get us to God, if we can be satisfied that something odd is happening, there are so many questions that scientists would love to explore. How does a body that's non-physical receive light waves and manage to translate them into an image? Because that requires some kind of physicality. And if there's a physicality there, how can it go through solid walls and not get blown off the building by the wind? So there's so much there that would be wonderful to actually be able to interact with and investigate and build studies around. It'll be fabulous to read and see what's going on. And I'm sure there's no shortage of volunteers who would like to be put through that experience either. So let's actually have something that scientists would enjoy working with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem I see with dualism, and this is what you had just said, is what's called the interaction problem. It's like, how does the kind of non-corporeal soul interact with the physical brain to give you all of the various correlations that we see between brain states and mental states? And the same thing happens, with the argument for the supernatural. So they'll talk about, the miracles and so on and supernatural events. But and they'll say, like, science can't test the supernatural, but if for some reason God chooses to interact in the world, then it is somehow measurable. You should, and it's kind of an interaction problem there, in the sense that there's some interaction with an agent, and even if we can't directly measure the agent, we should be able to measure the effect and be able to discern what would be kind of the normal happenings of the universe and the occasional interjection of an agent, and that's something that should be testable.
Yeah,
I asked Philip Goff this problem. So Brian, you've probably read Philip's book, or at least know who he is.
Brian had a conversation with Philip on our podcast.
Yes.
Oh, right. So
did.
I asked Philip this very question on this very podcast. By the way, Philip, if you're listening, thank you for having been on the show. It's been a while, and I'd love to catch back up with you, because
Philip has recently written another book, or started writing another book, so I'd love to get him on to talk about that, but that's a different conversation.
Yes, well, and so I'm saying all of that to say that this is not meant as criticism of Philip, what I'm about to say, but we talked about possible kinds of dualism on our episode with Philip. And if you're listening and you want to go back and listen, it was a delightful conversation. But the one question that I had for Philip was this exact question, Brian, the interaction problem. If there's any kind of dualism out there, we have, so we're talking about some sort of non-physical thing in any sort of traditional dualism, as far as I can tell. So you do have an interaction problem, and that was the one question that I asked Philip that I really wanted an answer to. And you can go back and listen, folks. He said, "Well, that's complicated," and that is what I got. And so I would love. I think Philip's moved away from dualism since. I'm not positive about that, but I hear.
I don't think I don't think he would accept the label of dualism. Is panpsychism is the consciousness is bedded right into the material, isn't it? I don't think Philip would accept the dualism charge. I'm fairly sure he'd push back on that.
Right. So yes, panpsychism, but what we circled in on was that there was some sort of a kind of dualist nature. So go back and listen, folks, and
I'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, but I don't know, Brian, how other than simple reproduction, how science would get behind a non-physical existence. Now, I grant you that the ability to reproduce a thing would be hugely important in terms of pointing out that there's something there. But how do you point out that something other than hey, we do this thing and something happens, but we can't point out what the actual cause is? How do you?
Yeah. So I would say in a case like that, so what you're doing is you're proposing some kind of entity or object or effect that is not directly observable, but should have observed effects. So we
do a lot of that.
Sure. Right. And so as much as you can be specific about what predictions you would make from your proposed agent or force or effect or whatever that we can then confirm, that gives you you could say that gives some evidence that whatever you're proposing is real, or you can say it's a useful construct. Either way, it's at least something there. And so I'm thinking, like, for example, there is in quantum mechanics, there's a kind of mathematical function called the wave function that is by itself not directly measurable. There's no experiment that directly measures that value, but the mathematics of quantum mechanics takes that wave function, and it is actually an equation for how that changes in time given the various elements that are in the area and their interactions, and then spits out predictions about what you would observe. And so maybe the wave function is real, or maybe it's just a construct, but you could imagine that, but like it makes really great, like very specific predictions. So you can imagine the same sort of thing. If you were imagining, say, an agent, like say God, and you can make specific predictions of, if you did this, then God would do that, right? And you did this a bunch of times, and you could demonstrate that. Then you'd go a long way in demonstrating that this agent actually exists, even if you can't directly measure it, right? And the problem is that the Bible says many times that if you pray in God's name, then you will see an effect. I mean, that happens many times, and Christians will constantly say this actually happens, right? But every time you actually try to confirm any of it, it all vaporizes, right? It disappears, and that's what you would expect to happen if there is no effect there. So when you then have an agent and you're making these predictions and they're not coming true, that is actually evidence against that agent actually existing. So I don't think the problem with the sort of dualism by itself has the interaction problem. It would predict certain things. So many of the predictions that people make from the God agent don't come true. And so that's, serious evidence against the agent. So I'm not against having things that are not measurable even in principle. It's just that if it doesn't make any specific predictions, that's a problem. And I think actually a lot of Philip Goff's work on panpsychism suffers from this. Essentially, it makes no specific predictions. And so in some sense, it's kind of like deism, where you make this claim that there's a God that doesn't interact with anything. Well, that means that there's basically nothing there. So that's how I see those. So I'm not against having things that are not even in principle measurable, but it has to make some kind of measurable effect, or else it's the same as saying nothing is there.
What you said there dovetails nicely with a podcast I listened to. This has been a while back, so I don't remember the show or the participants, but this person talked about their problem with emergent properties. So we probably, Matthew, I think you've used the phrase emergent properties in the past. I've used it. Brian, I don't know if you ever used that phrase or not. But what you said right there is what someone on this podcast said. Look, you can talk about emergent properties all you want. If you're emergent property, if you can't make any sort of predictive claim about this emergent property, if there's no way to measure an effect, if there's no way to reliably show the sort of emergent property you're talking about, then you're not actually talking about science. And so you're sort of saying that it's fine to have something hidden that we can't measure directly. But if we're going to make a claim, there has to be something measurable about it. And so thank you for that, because I agree.
Yeah. The early observations, or actually what convinced physicists, I think, of the existence of atoms originally, way before we could possibly measure them directly, had to deal with the predictions that were made from statistical mechanics, where essentially what you do is you say, assume that we have atoms and they can be in various states and we can just kind of count them up. You would make various predictions about the ideal gas law and about other sorts of interactions and some of them were seriously unintuitive, but turned out to be true. So by basically assuming these entities that were unobservable, but because they were discrete, had a very different sort of prediction than you would make if you assumed that matter was continuous or that sort of thing. And so the existence of atoms led to predictions that were very specific and quantitative and then confirmed. And so our confidence in the existence of atoms came out from this very idea. And there's probably a million other things that are like this, where the original things that were posited were unobservable, but their effects on a larger scale or over time or something like that were measurable that would do that.
Yeah, a decade ago, this past 4th of July, so a decade ago Monday, we called that thing the Higgs boson.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe nobody's heard of it. I don't know. Yeah. But what was it? 1953?
Yeah.
Brian, you'll know this a lot better than I did, but there's some history there. Other people who are really doing some next level thinking deserve credit along with Higgs. But this was mathematical prediction long before there was investigative science.
Yeah. And well, this is actually, I mean, this is an example. I do like to bring up this example because this is the, so 1950s, they predict the Higgs boson as part of an overall theory of how the particles exist and are produced and so on. And it fit naturally in this whole framework. And then it took 50, 60 years or more and thousands of people's work in order to verify this thing exists. And this is the sort of, and it was really, really hard to measure the Higgs boson, right? It was just supremely hard to measure, and yet because people made these predictions and then they put in the work to actually, and they didn't necessarily believe it, but they put in the work to actually be able to do it. The same thing happened with gravity waves. And I look at the level of effort put into things like that and the lack thereof in actually testing miracles. that contrast is all makes me feel like the theists are super lazy. They don't really want to test what they're doing to actually do controlled studies, or they're being dishonest, in which case they've done the studies, they realize it doesn't work, and so then they're just like, constantly in backtracking mode. But that contrast between the way the science pursues something that is really hard to observe and is able to do it, and then the excuses that the theists make about how hard it is to measure because we have this agent that is being fickle, it seems. They just seem like really lame sorts of excuses in contrast.
Yeah, I agree. That's such a beautiful full circle that I don't have anything to add. That's so nicely done.
Whenever I have this kind of conversation with Christians, and the subject usually ends up around on evidence, and inevitably I'll get asked the question, well, what evidence will you accept, or what do you want me to show you? And I always bat that back, and I say, that's not my question to answer. It's your responsibility to come up with the experiment that generates the evidence that I can then try and replicate. And that is never taken very well. So am I taking an appropriate response? And why do you think they might be rejecting that response?
Well, they don't believe something is true, and so they don't feel like that the burden of proof is on them. They want you to say, like, to debunk whatever they're doing, but it really is on them to do the properly controlled studies and not take the lazy way out of things. And that's
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've pretty much done discussing this. There's any burning issues that you two want to come out, but I want to do a call here. I think we have a secret guest. David, are you able to come on mic and make a few comments?
You tell me. Am I on mic?
You are
on
mic. Welcome. You've been an interloper hiding in the background, so welcome on to Still and Believe. Well, lovely to hear your voice again, David. You've been listening to this.
You're an interloper hiding in the foreground.
Yes. You've been listening to us for the last 2 hours, and I think you've got something you want to say.
Sure. I would say I've been a fly on the wall, but I know what I do to flies when I catch them on my wall. So that's probably not a good analogy. First of all, great conversation, guys. You've aided me in this day. You've given me 2 hours of thinking about something other than my own personal misery. So I appreciate you allowing me to interlope. The triviality of miracles, as much as I hate to do it, I have to agree with Andrew way back.
Okay, this makes me nervous.
It should. Honestly, Andrew and I have the kind of relationship where we'd rather disagree. but
I disagree. Sorry, go ahead.
The NDEs, that conversation, when you're talking about skeptics and atheists, and just general spiritualists who aren't theists, it's okay that their NDE claims are trivial. But when you're talking about God, and Christianity in particular, those NDE experiences should not be trivial. And so if it's of the same kind of trivial nature of, an ace of diamonds was placed on the ceiling, if that's the best God can do, then I don't follow the whole why it matters. That would prove dualism. I don't care. Because it needs to prove dualism with a little bit more power and authority than that. I would say that the Christians are not doing themselves favors with NDE claims.
Is your God a universalist, right? If that would be useful to know, right? If you've got an NDE and your God is the author of your NDE or provides the backdrop where that's possible, is he a universalist or is he a Baptist? You kind of want to know that.
Yeah, or is he Cthulhu? I mean, a Christian NDE claim should look something different than our friend Tara. If she talks about NDE, she has no Tara theological requirement to have anything that's not trivial. But I think that the God of the Bible does. And the fact that there isn't anything, that God doesn't, for instance, give someone a vision of some disaster that's about to happen that can be averted, and all he gives them is a 6 of spades. I think that's telling. You guys also talked a little bit about, I think it was you, Matthew, who coined the term argument by Big Book?
That was me.
No,
I think.
that was
Oh,
Brian.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Brian.
Yeah, I can't claim that one, I'm afraid.
So it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. I'm stealing it anyway. So it's
Yeah,
my
sorry.
term.
Yeah,
Argument.
I use it. I use it for Keener's book. I also use it for the Jesus and Eyewitnesses book by Balcom, which I actually have read. It's where people just quote a big book as if that is enough of an argument. And
Right.
but,
You
And
can use it
so
for that
Keener-
rarely talked about book, the Bible, too, I think.
Keener himself, in his Big Book, makes the argument, and he does when he's talking about it too, when he was kind of on the book selling circuit. All of these claims, even if you're not a believer, it means that it's got to mean that there's something going on. You can't deny that there's something. So even if you don't buy all of the claims or even any of the claims, just the great cloud of claims must mean something.
it does actually. I actually agree with that.
Terrible.
This is going to be fun. Okay.
No, it
David
won't,
says
because
it's
I won't be
terrible.
here long
Brian,
enough
you
to
say
argue
you
it.
agree. Okay. All right. You heard it here on Still Unbelievable. Folks. Here we go.
So the problem is, if all of your claims are bad, then having lots of them don't make your overall argument better. So, if we poll all of the children in the world who claim that there's a monster in the closet, an invisible monster under the bed, we would have to say, well, there's got to be something. But we don't, because we understand where that comes from, and we know better. That's not an argument for it. Even Christians don't accept that, because I can give you way more alien abduction stories and UFO stories than you can give me miracle claims. Christians
Brian,
don't believe that there's got to be something.
Yeah, but I always
Brian,
go and buy
what's
the
interesting
Amazon
here?
products which have 1,000 one-star reviews, because surely that counts for something, doesn't it?
It does not.
Right. Brian, you tell us. You said you agree that there is something. David
There's
says
something-
it's monsters hiding in the closet.
Yeah. So no, I said there's something going on, and that something is that people like stories about agents. I mean, and that's true about the monsters. It's true about alien abductions. It's also true for the miracle claims. And so it does say something that people are prone to interpret the lives of their events in terms of external agencies, and part of their psychological needs for feeling in control and things like that. So there's reasons for that. So there is something going on. It is not the thing that they're saying is going on. Like he's implying that there's something going on, is there's got to be some miracle in that pile. That's not true. But what it is true is that miracle claims are common, but so are UFO sightings and alien abductions and monsters under and they can all be explained by pretty much the same thing that we know actually happens. And there are reasons why we have methods in science to try to rule out these biases up front from what we're actually doing. You were talking, David, about the triviality of NDEs, and I totally agree with that. I think the triviality also comes in a lot of times with miracles, and so people will talk about, like, it's a miracle that I found my car keys, or a miracle that I met a certain person, or whatever. And in fact, in one of the videos that we did in that long discussion about miracles, there's one about J.P. Moreland getting who's a philosopher, getting a pool table. And there was like Pine Creek goes on this like rant about that. But what it says, it's like God is more interested in giving the pool table than curing leukemia in children or heart defects or anything else. And it just trivializes the whole thing and really calls into the question that just like if you're willing to accept that, just like, the random sorts of events that led to someone getting you a pool table as a miracle, then you're looking at the world with miracle colored glasses and seeing it everywhere. And it becomes
you've heard your argument when you say
absolutely.
things like that. And
I think to say something about your God. When J.P. Moreland's teenage daughters get a pool table and their friends down the street are getting beaten by their parents because their parents are alcoholics. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
For everybody listening,
there's no
part of the story. There's no part of the story where J.P. Moreland's teenage daughters have friends down the street getting beaten by their parents. So that's not actually part of the story, and that's me alliterating. My point is, if your God is giving a preacher's teenage daughters a pool table, and that's the best he can do, it should say something about your God. That's my whole point.
Right. Every one of the miracles in Craig Keener's book are trivial. They fall in that category. Because what you're telling me is, well, God chose to go a fingertip back from someone who we will never hear from and cannot validate, but, good for him. But he left St. Jude full of kids dying from cancer with a waiting list. It's all trivial when you think about it, but Christians are inside of the bubble, and they're not hearing how trivial their claims are. I can't bring myself to care. But let me just say one more thing real quick. I've had my own issues lately. I mean, I haven't had an eye grown back or anything. I haven't lost an eye, so that's good. But I did get hit by a van, and I got a badly broken leg, and it's a pretty serious situation. And, that's something that I've been very open and transparent about. I'm very fortunate to be as okay as I am. And I've got Christian friends and skeptic friends. Once again, everyone knows that because I podcast every week. I can't help it. The huge difference. Christians to a person have declared that they will pray for me, and I believe that they're very sincere. The skeptics went behind my back and put together, I won't even mention it because I'm not trying to gain supporters here, but they put together a thing and actually sent me money to take care of my immediate needs because I lost my source of income there for a while, and I'm trying to get back into that. My wife had to take off of work, so the income in our house plummeted. So this was information coming to everybody, and just the different responses. Christians praying, atheists did something that actually put bread on the table. As a person experiencing that in the mix, tell me why I should care about the subject of miracles at all. I just don't care. It's become so trivial that in the real world, when you're facing situations where an activist God would be useful, the Christians wrap their loving arms around, and they do love me. Don't get me, they are sincere. I consider them my brothers and sisters. They have a worldview that says my fantasy miracle thing is what you need. And people who don't have that worldview, make sure you have something to eat and have your rent paid. It's just a stark contrast in the real world that makes it all very clearly trivial. And I love theological discussions and mental onanism. I don't know what kind of words I can use on your show, so I'll just say that. But in the real world, when it comes right down to it, I'll take the atheist response every time. And you can have your miracles that can't be detected. That's my whole orientation toward this issue.
Thank you for that, David. And on the subject of that and of healing, I make no secret of the fact that I'm unkind to Christianity on this podcast. Andrew and I do not always play nice, and Christianity does get a very rough ride on this podcast because that's what Andrew and I exist for this podcast for. Hopefully our guests get better treatment, but certainly Christianity as an entity gets very harshly treated here, and I think justifiably so. But the reason why I say that is there's an opportunity for a very targeted miracle here. If my two good friends, David and Andrew, could get healing that would help them immensely. Now, I'm not just talking about eyesight, I'm talking about sense of humor and physical bodies as well. If that could happen and we can get to a God from that, I would change my tune on this podcast. And
I would use my platform to talk about it all the time. You couldn't shut me up about it.
Yeah. Okay, I don't have an audience in the millions. Unfortunately, it would be great if I did. But there are people who listen who would be influenced by me changing my tune on that.
Yeah,
so
well, I mean,
I think an impact.
I mean, this gets into one of the things we mentioned earlier, which was that if the Christians actually believed that the miracles actually happened and this was actually effective, we should see them at emergency rooms. We should see them, showing doctors that this actually works, and then it would become part of mainstream medicine. I mean, it really would.
Right.
If prayer was actually effective at healing people in any kind of reliable way, and the thing is, it doesn't even have to be 100%. I mean, even if it was 50% or 30% or whatever, I mean, it would often be better than what is currently available. for severe illnesses, then they should be at all this if they actually believe this stuff. And
Right.
that, I think that disconnect, I think, is telling.
Well,
I'm bowing out,
for
guys.
that, just for
I
a
really
moment,
appreciate you.
science.
I'm
Thank you,
I'm bowing,
David. Thank you, David.
I'm bowing out. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
man.
giving
Thanks,
me a shot there. Thanks.
Thank you, bro. Brian, there's something that you said there that I think I just want to follow up on a second. So you said, it doesn't have to be 100%. It can be 50% or 30%. I think those were numbers. I don't know. It's close enough. But science is good at measuring effects much, 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 much smaller than that, right? We can measure incredibly tiny effects, one in billions, right? And prayers go on all the time. And one of the important features of this show has been to say that if you're claiming miracles and you really believe they happen all the time, there is something reproducible, and we should be able to measure it. There's something there, right? And we can measure tiny, tiny effects. So anyway, sorry. I just thank you for that, because we really can or should be able to get behind this.
These are things that should be easily measurable, and way easier to measure than the existence of the Higgs boson or gravity waves or anything like that, which require decades and hundreds of thousands of people and a lot of really technical steps. This stuff would be trivial to test, right. and the show actually was there in comparison.
Exactly. Multi-messenger astronomy. Man, that would be a fun show. Not for this one, obviously. What an interesting and emerging field. Brian, I just want to say to listeners again, please go and read your blog. And Matthew, we did the horrible thing of not properly introducing Brian at the front, but I think most of our listeners will know you, Brian. But where I've made a point of talking about your blog several times. What are you doing right now? Where can the listeners find you? Tell us everything you want to tell us, because it's really important now.
Sure. So I'm in Rhode Island, in the United States. I work at a university called Bryant University, and I teach physics there, along with artificial intelligence and robotics and computer programming. So a lot of different things. So my blog is hosted on GitHub. So I have bblais.github.io, and it's pretty easily Googleable. I'm also on Twitter if you want to see that, and I kind of just write about anything that I feel like, but it wanders a lot on kind of how we think scientifically, and and then some of the technical things, kind of Bayes' theorem and so on, and apply to all sorts of different sorts of samples. Miracles being one of them. And so you can search on my blog there's a kind of a search bar. You can search for miracles and get all the stuff that I've written about that, along with all my various appearances on YouTube.
I thought your TED Talk was interesting and amazing. I really enjoyed your TED Talk. I hope that folks will go and find your TED Talk, because that was anyway. I think it was well worth getting into. Are you still doing the superhero podcast with your students? Because go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I do that sometimes. I have I've done a podcast a couple of times as part of something I call Cinema Sci, where we look at science applied to the cinema. So we've done things about space travel and things like that. It's been somewhat irregular. It just depends on which students are interested and what my schedule's like. And usually I usually put out like one a semester, kind of each class. But it's been kind of a project that kind of has come and gone here and there, so not very regular, unfortunately.
I teased that so poorly too, because I said superheroes. I just couldn't find Cinema Sci for some reason, but I'm subscribed to it, and I want more of Cinema Sci because I thought it was great.
Okay. So I'll have to do that now that you're getting a little bit of prodding there. And sometimes
it's great. It's fun, and to hear the students get into it, it's fun, and people should go and subscribe because it's a cool show. Matthew, what about you? Some closing thoughts?
Miracles I've always been skeptical of miracle. Well, I say always. Ever since I've been out as an atheist and been doing this podcast with you, we've always been rather scathing about miracles. And nothing that I've been exposed to has really shifted me on that. Brian has helped my thinking and to clarify my justifications on some of that. So thank you for that, Brian. And it's also helped me to shine a light on some of these stories that Christians say, and let's be honest, they are stories. Anecdotes are not evidence. You can't manufacture data out of a fancy story. You need to actually get in the grain of it and actually try and filter out the facts that are there and find a way to test them for their reliability. And it's really, really hard to do that. And that's all that's what we've been saying for the last 2 hours. They really, really are hard. And here's a challenge to you listeners, and it's not Andrew's challenge. Andrew can repeat his challenge if he wants, but the challenge to you, dear listeners, is if you do have a miracle that you really think happened in your life, try to apply some of the criteria that we've been talking about in this episode. Mm-hmm. Try to look at it in that kind of structure. Think about the things that you could eliminate as explanations for what's going on there. Think about the things that you can't eliminate. What would you do if you were to go into eliminate any natural explanation? If it's something that you don't know the full story about, what don't you know? What facts would help you to know, and how would you find out what those facts are? Is there a gap in the story that makes you wonder, maybe I don't have all the truth about that little element of the story? And if having gone through all of that, you're really convinced that you can demonstrate that this is a miracle, get in touch with us, reasonpress@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can help you to challenge it. And maybe if you're onto a good one, you can convince us. There's a challenge.
Right.
Bring it on.
If you're onto a good one, we're going to bring Brian, because I'm serious, Brian. We're not experts. We would need you. And Matthew, I am going to offer the modified version of the challenge briefly. So since 2015, I have offered this challenge in public everywhere I could think to offer it. And I've also offered it in private. I live in a family where my extended family has 4 Pentecostal preachers in it who believe in faith healing. So I'm not shy about this. They don't talk about faith healing in front of me anymore. It will not. I mean, they really will not bring it up, because I am the embodiment of evidence that the faith healing that they believe in doesn't work. But here's the challenge. And it doesn't have to apply to me. If you're the kind of Christian that believes in faith healing, but you think skeptics need not apply, okay, fine. I live in an extended community of people who are amputees, arms and legs and eyes. And sometimes I've got a friend that's a quadriplegic. He lost both hands and both legs up to the knees. He's a true believer. And there are plenty of people in my extended community that are true believers. You don't have to have your faith healer be willing to take a swing at Andrew the skeptic. I don't think I'd blame you if you didn't. But the people that I know that are true believers, I'll help you pay. I'll send those people anywhere, or help you bring a faith healer to them. Those people, they are the kind of person that I am. They'll pray any prayer, read any creed, participate in any ceremony, try to devote their lives to whatever religious tradition you think they should, in order to be worthy of a healing from your God. You don't have to heal me, but there are plenty of people out there that are true believers that deserve it, even by your own standards, if you believe in faith healing. Rather than worrying about Andrew, heal them. Send me your faith healer. I will stay out of it. You heal them, and I'll know. You're close to a convert right now. Even if you don't do anything with me. I've got 2 friends that I grew up with. They're twins. They were born without eyes. It's an awful birth defect. They've gone through their whole lives never even seeing light behind their eyelids. And they're both true believers. You don't have to worry about Andrew the skeptic. There are plenty of people that believe. Send me your faith healer, or let me send them to your faith healer. I'm not asking because I want to test your God. I'm asking because there are people in pain that need what you think you can offer. And if you are hearing me and you don't reply with the faith healer that you think can do the job, you're participating in their suffering. That's my challenge.
When you put that voice on, I always want to say amen when you're done.
You
need to stop that. You need to stop it.
It was not my preacher, but this is, look, I promise you that is the voice where I really care about the thing.
Yeah, I get it, and hopefully the listener as well. Just one more thing before I close out. Andrew doesn't know this yet, but I've managed to find another list of questions for atheists. So there's a tease. So I know how much Andrew loves them. I know how much you guys love to hear us attack them. So I'll see if I can get that one up as the next episode. We've got a few other ideas for what will be coming up soon, but questions episodes are always really easy to sort out, so I'll see if I can get that done in the next week. We'll have fun, you'll have fun. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Andrew. Always a pleasure. Thank you, David, for joining on. You're always a pleasure as well, and until next time, stay reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.